I'm always harping on about the importance of using a limited palette as much as you can. And in this video, I will show you how I painted a blue jay in watercolour using a limited palette of only 3 colours. I have a list of subjects on my computer that people have asked me if I'd consider painting for tutorials. The list is enormous and it never gets any smaller. On that list is a blue jay and it's been requested more than once, so I finally got around to making a tutorial of one. In this video, I'll give you a rundown of my painting process and I'll show you various parts of the painting. This past year or so, I've been trying as often as I can to really choose my paint colours carefully. Instead of using a heap of different colours on my paintings and dabbing into whatever paints that I have on my palette, I've been limiting the colours that I use. And I've found that doing that has been kind of freeing. It hasn't restricted me at all. Not only does it make for a harmonious painting, but it frees me up to focus on other things and it reduces the risk of creating muddy areas. It's kind of like a challenge that I set for myself now with each new painting. These days, before I start painting, I try to work out the fewest amount of colours that I think I'm going to need. I'll tell you the colours that I used soon, but first I'd like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Skillshare is an online learning community with thousands of classes where you can learn new creative skills or improve the skills that you already have. I've been working with Skillshare for about 7 years now, and I've published 13 watercolour classes with them. Whenever I'm needing some creative inspiration, I'll head to Skillshare for help. I've been wanting to update my logo for a while, and I thought I'd give it a go myself. Not knowing where to start, I went to Skillshare for ideas. I found this class by George Bokhua called Logo Design with Grids, Timeless Style from Simple Shapes. In this class, George shows you how to use grids to create simple geometric designs that convey their messages quickly and easily. I got some grid paper out and I've been playing around with my initials. No luck yet, but I'll keep trying. There are lots of different classes you can take on Skillshare on hundreds of topics. There's all types of painting and drawing classes. There's classes on photography. They even have cooking classes. You name it, it's on there. The classes are ad-free, which is needed while you're exploring new skills. New premium classes are launched each week, and the entire catalogue is now available with subtitles in Spanish, French, Portuguese and German. If you'd like to explore the site, the first 1,000 people to use the link in my description will get a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. So I hope you'll make use of it and start learning some new skills. All right, back to this painting. I used Winsor & Newton professional watercolour paints. The 3 colours I used were French ultramarine, burnt sienna and Winsor blue red shade. The paper I used was Arches cold press watercolour paper. The reference photo I used for this painting was taken by Richard Sagredo and I downloaded it from Unsplash. The first thing I did was try to mix a blue as close to the blue jay's feathers as possible. French ultramarine on its own wasn't quite right, so what I did was I added a little bit of burnt sienna to it until I got a colour I thought was close to the colour of the feathers. I tried that out on a piece of scrap paper just to see. And I felt that was getting close to what I needed. I put a touch more French ultramarine in there. And then I was happy with that. So it's French ultramarine with a tiny bit of burnt sienna mixed into it. I decided to let the colour of the bird wash onto the background to both add interest to the painting and also to allow me to include a lost edge along the back of the blue jay. Lost edges help to create the illusion of depth, and they also help to make the subject look less flat. So to do that, I worked on wet paper. I wet the back of the bird as well as the background. And then when I paint the back of the bird, the colour will flow off onto the background. Here I've got some clean water and my flat brush. You can see I've painted the water onto the bird and also onto the background there. I started by painting the colour that I mixed onto the back of the bird. It looked a little dark to me at this stage, but I knew that it would dry lighter than this. Then I got a bit more paint and I started to wash that colour onto the background as well. I started painting flat on the table, but then I lifted my board off the table and allowed the paint to flow over the wet paper up towards the top of the painting. I gave it a helping hand with the brush. I took a smaller brush then and I painted the blue closer to the edge of the blue feathers. And I also used it to paint in the feathers that were on the head. And here I pushed a bit of the colour off onto the wet paper as well on the background. While that first layer was wet, I painted on some Windsor Blue red shade down the bottom because I noticed the colour of the feathers there on the reference photo seemed to change slightly. The wing feathers have got some white markings on them, so I thought it would be a good idea to mask them off so that I could wash the feathers in altogether. Here I'm using the same colour that I used on the background to wash in the wing feathers on dry paper. On these feathers here, I'm using Windsor Blue red shade. I wash them in on the dry paper all at once. Once I've got them washed in, I use my liner brush to flick the colour onto the feathers on the back, and that creates the jagged edge there. I washed in these shorter feathers up here as well with the Windsor Blue red shade. On the tail, I used Windsor Blue on the outer feathers, and on this feather here, I've got the background colour, French ultramarine, mixed with a small amount of burnt sienna, and I'm painting that on dry paper. The paint bled a little bit too far onto those white feathers above the eye, so I'm using my small eradicator brush to take the paint off. The paper is dry, but my brush is damp. That cleans that area up. I painted the eye in with some black, and I mixed some French ultramarine with burnt sienna to make a grey, and I washed in the beak with that. Here I'm wetting the white feathers underneath the eye with some water. And I used the grey there as well to suggest some feathers. I dab my liner brush onto the wet paper and let the paint spread. And I paint a few little flicks off the edge. Here I've got a little bit of black. I make sure the paper's not too wet when I put that on because I don't want it to spread too far. The black I also mixed from French ultramarine and burnt sienna, but I used more pigment, less water. I use the black here too on these feathers that are darker. The paper's dry here though. And then I paint the area around the outside edge of the eye. And I carry those black markings down above the blue feathers, and the paper's dry here. When the wing feathers were dry, I used the black mixture to paint in all the dark markings on dry paper. I took my time and I made sure I kept an eye on the reference photo as I painted them in. All the feathers were painted in then, and they looked a bit flat. So I started to paint in some shadows along the edges where each feather touched. With these feathers here, I wet them with water where one feather touched the other, and then I used some of the Winsor blue to run it down the edge. The blue bled over the wet paper, creating a little subtle shadow. With the markings on the tail feathers, I painted them in with my black mixture on the dry paper. I made them quite dark at the top of the tail, but as I worked my way down, I added more water to my paint and I faded the colour away. I did that because I wanted the focus to be up near the head and the body of the bird, not all the way down here at the base of the tail. I wanted to make these feathers here look a little more curved, so I wet them with water and I ran some French ultramarine along the outer edges. And that helped to give them a bit of a curve. With the branch, I learned my lesson from the woodpecker that I painted a few weeks ago. I wanted to keep it simple. I love the fresh look of a simple initial wash that hasn't been painted over, so I was determined not to fuss with it this time and just accept what the paint gave me. So I wet the branch with water because I wanted to leave some of the white of the paper showing and I wanted soft paint edges. So my paper's really wet here and I've got some of my grey mixture that I mixed from French ultramarine and burnt sienna. I painted on with my big brush and I make sure I leave some of the white of the paper showing so I don't completely cover it with this grey mixture. I ended up lifting my board off the table and I allowed the paint to drift down to the bottom right corner. Because the temperature of the painting was predominantly cool, I wanted to add a few hints of warmth here and there, so I dropped in a little burnt sienna in a few places. I did the same thing on this other half of the branch. I allowed it to dry, then I re-wet it with water. Here I've got some grey, but it's quite dark. It's still a mixture of French ultramarine and burnt sienna, and I'm running it along the right edge to make a bit of a shadow there, make the branch look a little more curved. And I did the same thing here. And I darkened it near the bird where it was sitting to create a shadow there as well. When that was dry, I decided I wanted a bit more colour at the top of the tail here, so I wet it with water and I painted some French ultramarine on there. And I blended the colour away as I moved my way down the tail. Just got water on my brush now. And then I was happy with it. And there it is there. This painting went according to my plan, so I was quite happy. Unlike the branch I painted on the woodpecker painting I did a few weeks ago, this time the branch went the way I wanted it to, so I was happy. Hopefully there were some tips in there that you can use yourself. Thanks for watching. Please give the video a like and make sure you subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you again next week. Rolling and smiling. Gotta wait. Is that awkward? Is that?
Yeah.
What?
Yeah, do it again.
Were my hands too wide apart?
That's your limit.
Here.
Yeah.
Just this big? Not this big?
Too big.
This big?
Bigger.
This big?
Yeah.
This big? So it was this big. It hasn't restricted me at all. Not only does it make for a harmonious painting. I'll tell you the colours. I'll tell you the colours I used. I'll tell you the colours that did I do that again?
Yeah.
I'll tell ya. But first I'd like to thank Skillshare for sponsoring this video. I said sponsoring. This time the branch went the way I wanted it to, so I was happy.